maybe.
Okay. So just a brief introduction. Rabbi Rashi Simon is founding director of Kesher, the Learning Connection. This is part of the 3-week series. Tonight's shiur is called The Arch of Titus Yields Its Mysteries. Rabbi Simon will take Q&A after the shiur. In the meantime, I give you Rabbi Rashi Simon. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary, for your kind introduction and for your assistance from the tech side of things as well this evening. And welcome to everyone for our discussion tonight on the subject of the Arch of Titus Yields Its Mysteries. We are, of course, now within the so-called 9 days, the lead up to Tisha B'Av. We are within the 3 weeks, the season of the year when we inevitably are conscious of the weight of the exile. As Rav Yaakov Emden writes, actually we should have this awareness all the time, but at least these days of the year, it should be sort of a continuous feature in our consciousness. Not that it should lead us to depression, but nevertheless the awareness, let's say, of what has been lost. And I'd like to discuss tonight some aspects of the Churban Habayis, the second Beis Hamikdash. So you have at the top of the page, for those who are making use of the screen, which I hope you see in front of you, 17th of Tammuz is the prelude to tragedy, and it sets the stage, of course, for the events to follow, especially on Tisha B'Av itself. The Talmud indicates that the day of the 9th of Av was sort of marked out for tragedy from a very early stage in Jewish history. And as is very well known, it also was the day of the Churban for the first temple and the second temple as well. The Talmud says clearly that Bayis Sheni, Churban Bayis Sheni is Chamir Lan. It's more weighty for us. It weighs more heavily upon us. And even though, of course, the prophet Yirmiyah wrote of and described and foresaw, as well as experienced, the destruction of the temple at the hands of the Babylonians, and the second temple, we don't have that kind of revelation about it. Nevertheless, because it's closer to our times, we feel it more heavily. Now, you might say, well, the rabbis may have made that observation writing in the 3rd or 4th centuries. Of course, for us, it's so long ago. Both tragedies are ancient history for us. But nevertheless, I would say that we can understand why the Roman Churban is more paramount in our thoughts. It's like a person who maybe in his 30s experiences bankruptcy, the bitterness of bankruptcy. And he's down and out for a time, but he manages to rebuild his business. And over the subsequent maybe 20 years, his business is flourishing once again. And then he falls once more on hard times and he goes bankrupt a second time in his 50s. Even if he's reflecting maybe 20 years later, and he's been on Skid Row ever since, of course, the second bankruptcy is much more painful to him because he's still suffering the effects. The first bankruptcy, he managed to recover from it and rebuild his business and his career. So I think it's easy for us to understand how the Roman exile, which is the one in which we still find ourselves to this day, of course, is paramount for us. Moreover, in item number 3, where it says, whoa, lost it. Sorry about that. It's back. Right. In item number 3, Rome is in the language and in the metaphor of the rabbis, the personification of the wicked government. It's villainous, and the Talmud contains many references, some of them probably sort of occluded by the censor, but some which are nevertheless evident enough. The rabbis regarded Rome as the epitome of wickedness. It was, of course, the Romans who destroyed the Beis Hamikdash. It was Latin that was their language, later the language of the church, which persecuted the Jews mercilessly, of course. And therefore, whereas the rabbis had a certain measure of respect, maybe even admiration for Greek language and Greek culture, that was not the case when it came to Rome. We find that the rabbis rebuke one another for praising the Romans, for finding something good to say about them. Rome and Jerusalem symbolize two ways of thinking, two empires. Not that Jerusalem represented such an empire, but it was an empire of the spirit, and Rome represents the antithesis to it, and therefore Rome and Jerusalem are seen as polar opposites in our thought, and to a certain degree in the thought of the Romans themselves as well. I'd just like to mention a very interesting explanation I once read years ago about the phrase that appears in the Haggadah, Arami Oved Avi. So actually, although it's in the Haggadah, it comes from Parshas Kisavo, which we'll read in the Parsha in a few weeks' time, towards the end of the book of Dvarim. Arami Oved Avi. So this is usually rendered, my father was a wandering Aramean. Arami Oved Avi. But Rashi says, Arami Oved Avi, an Aramean, that is Lavan, sought to destroy my father. But either way, its relevance to the Haggadah is obscure. Why does that become the centerpiece of the story of the redemption from Egypt and the persecution that preceded it, and the sense of exhilaration that comes from the liberation from slavery? Lavan, Arami, Oved, Avi, I mean, that happened such a long time before. And in any case, however villainous Lavan was, he was not the proximate cause of the Jewish people going down to Egypt. They went to Egypt because of completely different reasons. Lavan was already just a fading memory by that time. So why do we build a whole Haggadah around the villainy of Lavan? Bikesh la'akores hakol, he wanted to uproot everything. Okay, Lavan was not the nicest guy, but why do we heap contumely upon him in the Haggadah? I think it's a good question, actually. Much has been written about it. I mean, how many Haggadahs are there in print? Hundreds and hundreds. So probably every Haggadah has its own take on it. I saw something very novel, which I think, well, it's certainly relevant to our shir, and I think has a lot to commend itself. The rabbis comprised the Haggadah during the Roman period, the period of Roman persecution. Like we have Rabbi Akiva v'Chaverav, who are hiding out in Bnei Brak. Of course, they were under the heel of the Roman domination. Rabbi Akiva and his friends who were walking on Har Sophim, and they gazed down at the Temple Mount, and they saw a fox, a jackal wandering around. Of course, it's very well known that Rabbi Akiva and his contemporaries lived in the dark shadow of the Roman persecution. That is the era in which the Haggadah, the way we know it, was formulated. The essence of the Haggadah was formulated during that time. Arami is a code. Arami is an anagram for Romi, but their rabbis could not say that Rome is worse than Pharaoh, is worse than Nebuchadnezzar, is worse than Sancheiriv. They couldn't say that. So they had to put it in a code language. Arami is, as I said, an anagram for Romi. Romi is the worst, but they couldn't say that outright. And this would help explain why this becomes the centerpiece of the whole Haggadah. And it's a way of the rabbis in a subtle manner, but probably a manner that was understood by their contemporaries, of castigating and execrating, I should say, the Romans. Okay, we're up to item number 4, the Arch of Titus. So I'm sure many of the participants in the shir tonight have been to Rome, and if you have been to Rome, you very likely have made a point of visiting the Arch of Titus. And even if you haven't been there, no doubt we have all heard of it. The Arch of Titus was built in the year 82 CE. It was shortly after the death of Titus himself. It was built by his brother, who succeeded him to the throne, to celebrate the sack of Jerusalem that was accomplished about 10 or 12 years earlier. Now, to be honest, before I prepared for this shiur, I was always perplexed why the Romans who accomplished so much, who built the greatest empire of the ancient world, why they were so preoccupied with putting down the uprising in Judea. The world imagines that Israel is a large and powerful country. It may be powerful, but it's certainly not large, not in numbers, and certainly not in size. But we know that the land of Israel, ancient Judea, modern Israel, even the biblical land of Israel, is very small compared to the whole region, and certainly compared to the Roman Empire. Why were the Romans so preoccupied? Why were they so fixated on the Judean revolt? Well, the answer is there are several reasons why, but the reason that I want to highlight now is the fact that for them, the sack of Jerusalem was the victory of the century for Rome. You see, they built that Arch of Titus to celebrate the victory, and we'll look more closely at it shortly, because for Rome, I made a bracha earlier, just for those who are wondering, because the vanquishing of the rebellion of the Jews represented a victory of theology, not only of military consequence. You see, for the Romans, the fact that they sacked Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, plundered the temple, as we shall see, represents for them a triumph of Jupiter, the Roman god, over the God of Israel. It is noteworthy that often foreign gods were incorporated into the pagan practices of the Romans. The idea of polytheism by its nature is pluralistic. If there are multiple gods in the pantheon, then adding another one or two gods, or maybe demoting some who are not performing, is not that difficult to achieve. Moreover, the Romans, as a matter of probably realpolitik, rather than disgracing or trashing the gods of a city or a state that was conquered, they incorporated the local god into their worship, and they would readily allow the locals to continue to worship their god as long as they also worshiped a few of the Roman gods as well. It was share and share alike. Obviously, this is not possible with the God of Israel, because the God of Israel is a jealous God. The God of Israel does not contemplate, does not tolerate other gods. You shall have no other gods before me, is the second of the Ten Commandments. And of course, this represents the essence of the most fundamental contribution of Judaism to ancient thought, and that is there's only a single God. And for that reason, the Romans saw this as a sum-zero game. And when they vanquished, when they triumphed, so for them it was a cause of enormous celebration. It's worth mentioning that the Romans, as I said, when they would conquer a city, they would normally sort of court the local deity in the belief that a patron deity could be enticed to desert his city and people with the promise of an improved cult. Also, there's a Roman concept of pietas, that's Pietas, which demanded that gods be honored, not humiliated or angered. So the idea of celebrating the destruction of Jerusalem and symbolically, as we shall see, flaunting the triumph of Jupiter over the God of Israel was unusual for them. You see, the idea of pietas is the idea that gods should be honored, not humiliated or angered. It's not worthwhile. It's risky business, and there's nothing to be gained by it. And this concept, which is in item number 5, for those who are following, this concept explains the Medrash of Yosef Meshita, which, again, I will confess, always perplexed me. Now, I'm referring to the Medrash. If you're not familiar with it, let me share it with you now. It's actually based on the pasuk, which I'm sure you remember, a pasuk in Parshas Toldos, when Yitzchak's eyes were dim. He was blind or nearly blind, and he could not readily discern who was standing before him. And Yaakov came into his tent in the guise of Esav. And the pasuk says, "Vayar es begadav, vayarach es begadav," that Yitzchak inhaled the aroma, and he said, "Re'ei reach b'nikareach hasadeh." The fragrance of my son is like that of the field, Asher Baruch Hashem, which is blessed by God. And Rashi asks that if he's covered his arms with a goat skin, that's very malodorous, so it requires an explanation. But the Medrash says, "Vayarach es begadav." The word can be read bogadav. We're not entirely interactive right now, so I won't challenge you. What does the word bogdav mean? But I'm sure you know, many of you know, that begadav means his clothing. Bogdav means his traitors. Boged is a traitor. Traitor. Traitor, if you can't understand my American accent. Vayarach es bogdav, according to the Medrash, Yitzchak sensed there would be traitors who would descend from the man in front of him, which means that he was concerned, what is the future of the person before me? And Yitzchak was troubled by it because he could anticipate that there are traitors, there are turncoats to emerge from my son. But according to the Gemara, it's in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, it's also a Medrash, this refers to a particular boged, that Yitzchak foresaw that Yaakov would have a descendant who was a traitor, but even his traitor would have a great deal of merit. And says the Gemara, this refers to Yosef Meshita. Who was Yosef Meshita? At the time that the Romans trashed the Beis Hamikdash, they defiled it, and they entered into the inner sanctuary, and they were afraid to go into the holy section. They were in the Azara, in the courtyard. They were afraid, and they said to a Jew called Yosef, they said, "You go in and take us something, bring out something to us." And the Gemara says how he did so, and he came out with the golden menorah. And they said to him, "A lowlife like you comes out with such a glittering, such an amazing, holy, sacred object. It's too good for you. Go and get something else." Yosef Meshita had a moment of regret, a moment of tshuva, and he said, "It's enough that I have angered my maker on one occasion. I'm not going to do it again." And they said, "If you don't do it, we're going to kill you and we'll torture you to death." And Yosef said, "I'm not going in again." And that is exactly how he died. So this is Vayarach es Bogadav, even the Boged, even the low life, the traitor who helps the Romans to plunder the Beis Hamikdash because they don't want to do it themselves. Even he did tshuva at the last moment, and he died, you could say, Al Kiddush Hashem. My problem with this Medrash is, Medrashim have many layers of meaning, but if you take Al Derech HaPshat, I found it strained credulity that the Romans were so solicitous of the sanctity of the Beis Hamikdash that they didn't want to go in, and they sent somebody else to go in instead. But when I discovered this concept of pietas, that explains the Medrash. The Romans indeed were too awestruck or cautious or pious to do so. They didn't want to enter. They were not prepared to enter the Holy of Holies. And therefore, they sent someone else in to do their corrupt work on their behalf. So this was a characteristic of the Roman perspective on religion, and they had respect for the gods in general. But because of the rebellion, because the Jews refused to accept the authority of Rome, or even sort of, as we said before, live and let live, they refused to accommodate the idea of an additional deity together with the God of Israel. And ultimately, as we know, that led to the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash and the exile. Of course, there were other considerations as well, certainly. What's interesting, if you see in number 6, is that the civic center of Rome was actually remodeled to reflect the victory over the Jews and their gods. That's why I say it wasn't only the Arch of Titus. They reconfigured the whole of central Rome in order to celebrate, in order to commemorate, because that was their crowning achievement, because as I said, there was a theological element for that. For them, in number 7, the sack of Jerusalem meant that the Roman gods, and in particular Jupiter, had defeated, chas v'shalom, the God of Israel. And there is a logic to that from their point of view as well, that Jupiter is the king of the gods. And since the Jews worship only one God, unique among ancient peoples, as we very well know, the Jews were the only monotheists for many hundreds of years, until shortly after the Churban Habayis, when Christianity got into the act, although they equivocate on the monotheism. But certainly in antiquity, Judaism was the only monotheistic religion. So they reckoned that the God of Israel must be a rival of Jupiter, because Jupiter is the king of gods and the God of Israel is the only God there is. So there must naturally be rivals. And again, the fact that they triumphed in the military encounter made them certain that their theological position was secured as well. Moreover, after the Churban in item number 8, the dues that were paid to the Beis Hamikdash were now paid to the temple of Jupiter. And in their way of thinking, the Jewish God is subjugated to Jupiter and captive in Rome. I'm kind of belaboring this perspective, even though I keep kind of catching myself, because what I'm articulating is, of course, total heresy from our point of view. But I'm trying to paint a picture in a historical way that helps us better understand why Rome was the evil empire. Again, from our perspective, we could fill the page with enemies who have acted towards us in the most sadistic and vicious way. Every century brings more of the same. But for the rabbis, and even in Talmudic times, again, there had been many others who had oppressed the Jews and who had fought with the Jews, as we know, even from the biblical record. But Rome was, so to speak, the worst of the worst, because there was that theological edge to it as well. A generation later, as if to emphasize the point, the Emperor Hadrian, the one who built the wall in the north of England, would even establish a shrine to Jupiter on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. By the way, some of what I'm discussing now, I learned from an article, very kind of learned academic article by a professor of archaeology called Jody Magnus. Jody Magnus, it would seem, is a granddaughter of Judah Magnus. If that name is familiar to you, he was the first president of Hebrew University. The Magnus Press, Hebrew University Press, is named for him. And I find it kind of sad that his granddaughter lives in North Carolina, North Carolina, and teaches archaeology. She's probably quite knowledgeable about Jewish matters. Don't know how prominently Jewish values feature in her life, but she definitely knows a lot about ancient Rome, and she's written an article called "The Arch of Titus at Rome and the Fate of the God of Israel." And she has an analysis of this question, and she argues persuasively that there was a shrine. Hadrian built a shrine to Jupiter on the Har Habayis. So if we're not happy that the Har Habayis today is occupied by a mosque, I suppose it still is a step forward from a temple to Jupiter, which the Romans had built many hundreds of years previously. You can imagine how galling that was for Rabbi Akiva and his contemporaries, that having destroyed the Beis Hamikdash and trashed the place, leaving it a heap of rubble, they subsequently rehabilitated it as a temple to Jupiter. I'd like to now consider more closely the Arch of Titus itself. So Titus, the man Titus, is at the apex of the passageway, rising to heaven on the back of an eagle, above the spoils panel. That's the main panel that shows the procession with the various vessels of the Beis Hamikdash, of which the most prominent is the menorah. As we know, we'll speak about that shortly. But above that is an image of Titus himself, who was ascending to heaven on the back of an eagle, and victories hovering in the spandrels. In other words, the symbolism is that Titus is becoming a god himself, having accomplished the great challenging task of putting down the Judean rebellion. So now it's like he has vouchsafed his place among the pantheons of gods himself. The spoils from Judea paid for the Colosseum as well as the Temple of Peace. The Temple of Peace was sacked a few centuries later, not much evidence of it any longer. This is an ancient instance, I would say, of Orwellian usage, the Temple of Peace, where treasures from the Beis Hamikdash were displayed. And there were victory monuments were completed in the year 80 as well. So this is what I mean when I say that the whole of ancient Rome, central Rome, was reconfigured in order to celebrate this event. Of these buildings, of course, it's the Arch of Titus, which still remains, and certainly for me, when I visited Rome some years ago, I definitely wanted to visit the Arch of Titus. It's not far from the Colosseum. Actually, the notes for the tourists to view and to read indicate that the Colosseum was built with the plunder from Judea and mostly with the slaves, the Judean slaves as well. So the Arch of Titus was a central component of ancient Rome itself, and they had a great procession. And the great procession is described by Josephus and others in terms of what they saw and who was there and what happened to those accoutrements, to those vessels. And I'd like to now consider the most important of them, and that is the menorah. But before we get there, I would like to make a further observation, which is obvious to all of us, and the fact that we are here tonight is the greatest testimony to the fact that the victory lap of the Romans was premature. Judaism continued to exist. We're up to number 12, actually. I'm sorry, it's almost obscured. Number 12, the victory lap proved premature. Judaism continued to exist even in the absence of the korbanot, the absence of the temple rituals. The Torah and the mitzvot were and remained central to Judaism, even more so than the service in the Beis Hamikdash itself. And this came as a great surprise to the Romans, and ancient Rome now is consigned to the history books and to the history buffs, to the museums and to the tourists. And of course, Am Yisrael Chai, we have survived. And there's an irony here that the Jews were sometimes accused, in number 13, accused of being atheists and were persecuted accordingly, because since they didn't go to the temple, they didn't go to worship the various Roman gods, so to be godless was a terrible contempt. And the Jews were sometimes persecuted as being atheists because they did not worship the Roman gods. And that idea of worshiping a God who has no image, who has no cult, who has no temple, was something completely foreign to the ancient pagan way of thinking. So the idea that the Jews were driven from their land, their temple was destroyed, they no longer had the means of serving their God in their temple, and they were not even willing to serve anyone else's gods in their temples. For the Romans, it made them mad. But of course, the Jews retained that conviction and that determination. And that brings us to the most famous symbol and the most prominent one on the arch. And of course, that is the menorah. The menorah was specifically chosen, that particular menorah was specifically chosen as an emblem of the state of Israel. And I have a picture of it here. And I'm going to hold it up. Sorry, I don't have it on my computer, but you can see it, I hope. Can you see this this image of the menorah? And when I say the menorah, I use the term deliberately because, sorry, I just want to get that. Sorry. Sorry, I'm just having some tech issues. Yeah, the that particular menorah is the one that is depicted on the Arch of Titus itself, and that is the menorah that has become the the emblem of the state of Israel. Now, this designation was contested at the time. Actually, there was a sense of irony that the founders of the state of Israel have chosen as their emblem a menorah, which no doubt is an ancient Jewish symbol and remains so even to this day. But that particular menorah, the one on the Arch of Titus, would seem to be an ironic choice. And I'd just like to read you a few lines from the thoughts of Alex Mishori, an Israeli art historian. And he explained the rationale why they chose the image of that particular menorah. The menorah is returned from the Arch of Titus, where it symbolizes defeat, humiliation, and disgrace, and is installed in a place of honor on the emblem of the state, the establishment of which is testimony to the eternity of the Jewish people. In other words, it was no coincidence at all that the state of Israel chose that particular menorah for their emblem, because it was precisely that irony and that contrast of the role of the menorah as it was carved by the Roman craftsmen onto the Arch of Titus as a symbol of the sacking of Jerusalem and the vanquishing of the Jewish people and the triumph of Rome and of Jupiter over the God of Israel, that we can now say we are reclaiming that image and we are restoring it to a position of prominence within Jewish life, and it stands, a replica to this day stands opposite the Knesset itself. And yet this choice was highly controversial because that menorah has features which are highly contentious. Fortunately, I've lost my sorry, I'm just trying to get my image back on the screen, which I'm not succeeding in doing. Okay.
I think we'll manage with that, Rabbi Simon.
Okay, thank you. Right. So I'm not sure whether you can see this, but if you can, then you'll notice that the lower part, the pedestal, has a higher. Okay, you know what? We won't do that. So, is a this menorah that is engraved on the Arch of Titus is not like the menorah that we have evidence of in the Beis HaMikdash. Let me explain. The Torah describes in considerable detail the proportions, the size, to a certain degree, the shape of the menorah, the adornments that characterize it, of course, the fact that it's made of gold. But the Torah itself does not clarify what is the support for this beautiful candelabrum, on what does it stand. And the evidence, the archaeological evidence, and certainly Jewish tradition as well, maintains that it stood on a tripod. And that's why I wish I could get this picture up again, but we're not doing it. I do have some examples of excavations in Israel and elsewhere as well, from ancient Israel, that depict that menorah as standing on a tripod, and this is always the case, and there are many examples of it. Wherever the base, the pedestal, is discernible, whether in inscriptions or in mosaics, they always appear on a tripod. It's very odd that this one on the Arch of Titus should be on this sort of pedestal, this multi-tiered pedestal. Moreover, if one looks closely, you can see that there are dragons on it. There are images of dragons that are engraved in that pedestal on which the menorah stands. The Talmud, however, says that if a person finds a vessel with a carving or picture of a dragon, he should throw it into the Dead Sea, because that is indicative of the fact that this is an instrument of idolatry, or this is even an adornment for idolatry, or this is itself an idolatrous icon. The dragon was an ancient motif often found by the Romans and many others, and certainly it has no place in the Beis Hamikdash. This has led many to wonder how, this menorah could possibly be authentic. Actually, I'm sorry, I need to just scroll down a bit more. You can see it. Yeah, so we're up to number 15, the problem of the pedestal. Chief Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Herzog, former Chief Rabbi of Ireland, who was a scholar in his own right, a very meticulous scholar, a Talmid Chacham, and also an academic scholar as well. He was troubled by this, and he wrote an article in which he speculates that the tripod must have been detached in transit. In the journey from Jerusalem to Rome, and a Roman artisan replaced it with a decorative pedestal. Since the Romans had plundered it, so they Romanized it a little bit. They were not troubled by that transformation. And others have suggested, one could also speculate that possibly the illustration was not authentic to the menorah itself as well. But as Chief Rabbi Herzog suggests, it may have just been the work of a Roman artisan. But if you look at number 17, Professor Daniel Sperber has another theory. He suggests that actually it was not a Roman artisan who had to do a repair job, and he did it in an inauthentic fashion, but rather the menorah that was plundered by the Romans actually did have those dragons on it. And who would have done it? Well, the answer may well be Herod. Now, Herod is vilified in our tradition, lahavdil, by the Christians as well. Herod was a Roman vassal. He sought to ingratiate himself with the Roman authorities. He had a complex relationship with the Beis Hamikdash. The temple that was destroyed by the Romans, by Titus in the year 70, was actually built by Herod. Herod expanded the ancient temple, he refurbished it, and he added architectural glory to that building. Now, he may have done it for his own reasons, for his own vanity. It's been said that Herod had an edifice complex. He built a lot of big buildings, Herodian, if you've ever been there, and elsewhere. And he may have done it to ingratiate himself with the Jews, but at the same time, he sought to maybe Romanize the temple. Josephus describes how he had a golden eagle fashioned over the entrance to the Beis Hamikdash. Again, the eagle was the symbol of Rome itself, and the students of the Chachamim removed it, possibly at risk of their own lives. So Professor Daniel Sperber suggests that Herod added the dragons to ingratiate himself with Rome. But I would say at least he left off the naked nymphs riding them, as we find in the Didima in modern day Turkey and elsewhere, where those dragons or sea creatures were associated with, as I said, the naked nymphs. So he did us that favor at least. Yet all the contemporaneous images depict the tripod base, and that could be an act of defiance of Herod's Romanization in order to show that we don't accept Herod's Roman influenced innovations, and we are always going to depict and regard the menorah in its authentic form as having the tripod. So according to this suggestion, this speculation, perhaps that image of the menorah is accurate insofar as the base is concerned, because it was Herod himself who introduced it, including those carvings of the dragons as well. Rabbi Herzog was very distressed at the choice of this menorah as the emblem of the state of Israel. But as we have seen, it wasn't by accident, because the religious advocates wanted a different kind of image. They wanted a menorah possibly with the, I'll tell you exactly, actually, um, they wanted a different symbol. But B'kitzur, they were happy with the menorah as the a symbol, but a different menorah, a more authentic menorah. But as I said, from the political standpoint, this Roman depicted menorah fits perfectly to the secular narrative, in which the ancient menorah of Jerusalem was plundered by the Romans, and it has now been restored and recovered by the modern state of Israel. There is, however, a very I think, insightful suggestion for which there is some historical evidence as well. And that is that although in the depiction on the arch of Titus, the menorah is the most prominent symbol, there may have been another artifact that was plundered by the Romans, which was even more important. And according to Josephus, when he describes the procession, the parade, the last item was saved by Titus as the most climactic example, the symbol of Roman triumph over Jerusalem, and that was the Sefer HaAzara. The Rambam writes that there was a Sefer Torah that was kept in the Beis Hamikdash, that was written possibly by Ezra HaSofer himself. Actually, there's another Girsa, Sefer Ezra or Sefer Azara. Azara is the courtyard. Ezra would mean Ezra the scribe himself. Either way, this is like the paradigm. This is the original text of the Sefer Torah against which other Sifrei Torah were checked for letter perfect accuracy. When the Romans plundered the temple, of course, they plundered that Sefer Torah as well. Titus would have known very well that the Sefer Torah is the very symbol, it's the very embodiment in a symbolic way of the essence of Judaism, and Kavayachol, it symbolizes HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. The Roman craftsmen who carved the images on the Arch of Titus may have only included images that were displayed in that temple of peace. But Titus kept the Sefer Torah in his own royal palace. And I would like to suggest that maybe that menorah is actually a very apt symbol, because although it represents the physical a loss of the temple, the physical exile of the Jewish people from our land, but the return of the Jewish people to their land also is symbolized by that same menorah. What about the imprecisions and the inaccuracies of it? I would like to suggest something, and that it's not really my own idea. I saw it in an article by Rabbi Dr. Meir Soloveitchik, and that is that it's actually the Sefer Torah which is the essence, and the Sefer Torah is not subject to plundering. It's not subject to the fury of the armies of legions. And I would just like to end with a quote of which you see a few words on your outline as well, which is in front of you if you're still looking at the screen, for those who are still with us. In the about 100 years ago, actually, the classic book of Jewish history was called A History of the Jewish People by Margolis and Marx. When I was in graduate school many years ago, although this book had been published already decades before that, it still remained quite popular. And to be honest, I don't think it's been superseded. Although the language, as you shall see, is slightly archaic, it was written about 100 years ago, was published about 100 years ago, but there's a certain beauty to it as well. And I would like to end with this short paragraph. Their chapter on the sacking of Jerusalem, on the destruction of the temple, the vanquishing of Judea at the hands of the Romans, ends with the following paragraph. Thus ended the 7 Years' War against the power and brutality of Rome. Once more, the daughter of Zion sat and wept for the sanctuary that lay in ashes, for her sons that had fallen by the sword, and for her daughters carried away into slavery and given over to dishonor. The nation had been vanquished. The land of Israel was a province of the mighty empire. Yet there remained one thing that the fury of legions was powerless to destroy, the invincible Torah of the Jew. And with that, I would like to suggest that this is the true secret of the Arch of Titus, that which is not depicted there, that which lies behind it, that which animates the Jewish people and Jewish history, and that which sustains us to this day. And the reason that we can enjoy visiting Rome and see the remnants, the relics of ancient Rome, and yet we have the pride and the vitality and the confidence in the future of the Jewish people as well, because even the fury of legions was powerless to destroy the invincible Torah of the Jew. Thank you very much, and I appreciate everyone listening and bearing with me in my technological limitations as well. If there are any questions or comments, we can certainly take them now. I'm sure that if everyone unmutes themselves, then we'll have a chance to discuss it. So please, if anyone has any thoughts or questions.
Yeah, David Levy here. I've always wondered, actually, again, another point about the depiction of the menorah under the arch. We tend to believe it, that the branches are curved, and that may be taken from the way we've seen it under the arch. But Rambam holds that the branches were straight. And there's a picture of his depiction of it in the Art Scroll Chumash.
Yes, indeed.
What would you say about that?
So the Rambam probably never saw the Arch of Titus, and even if he did, I'm not sure he would have been convinced. He would have made the observation, I'm sure, that we've discussed in detail, that the depiction of the arch of that menorah is very possibly inauthentic because of the pedestal. We know it was a tripod, and we discussed that. So the Rambam might say, and we could say, so to speak, in defending his view, that the Romans depicted the menorah according to what suited them. We're not necessarily dependent on the integrity or the authenticity of the Roman stonemason to provide a reliable likeness of the menorah. Having said that, the view of the Rambam, it would appear to be a minority view. When we get around Hanukkah time, there's a certain very resourceful, active organization that delights in, building prominent menorahs all around, and they like to depict it that way, according to the Rambam's view. But most ancient depictions that we have, and unfortunately, I don't have much luck with the images here. I don't know whether you can see it here. I've got the two. There are two here, the lower one and the upper one. In both cases, you can see, well, certainly the lower one, they are curved. And the upper one, they do look a bit angular, possibly like the vision or the version of the Rambam. So basically, I would simply say the jury is still out on it. The Torah itself, of course, does not say definitively. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this machlokes. The archaeological evidence, to the extent that we can consider the depiction on the Arch of Titus to be accurate, certainly tells us that they were curved. As I said, the Rambam could dispute that in a few ways, as we have seen. I'll just add, though, according to Professor Sperber, that menorah could be authentic in the sense that it really was the one that was plundered by the Romans, and it was Herod who altered it. But I don't think Herod would have altered the shape of the candelabra as well, the arms. But as I said, the jury is still out on it. If you want to go to the old city and you visit the museum of the Third Temple, there you can see the menorah. And I think they also follow the traditional vision rather than the Rambam, depiction. So,
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think when we visited the Cairo Geniza earlier this year, I think there were also some jottings.
yes.
Found to be triangular with the
Yes,
tripod base.
that's right. That's right. That depiction of the Rambam, and that is remarkable. It actually derives from an autograph manuscript of the Rambam himself, in which if you want to see a very excellent version of it, if you look in the Living Torah by Aryeh Kaplan, you can see his depiction of that based on the Rambam. So yeah, it's fascinating to see. That was evidently the Rambam's view. He had many novel opinions, and perhaps that was one of them. And certainly, I wouldn't be presumed to say, which opinion is more authentic. If you want to stick with the Rambam, you won't go far wrong.
Okay, if there are no more questions, Rabbi Simon, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the community for a fascinating, insightful, and very topical share. It really gives us a lot of food for thought for the coming weeks. Really
Thank
much
you.
appreciated, and many thanks.
Thank you very much. I wish everyone a good Chodesh, and we hope that Tisha B'Av will very soon in our days be transformed, Limei Sason v'Simcha, for joy and gladness. Ken Yiratzon.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank
you.